Every morning at exactly 6:45, Frank Donovan began his workday. Not by checking inventory, not by opening his email, or by reading production reports. He began by walking. For 38 years the route had hardly changed. Past loading dock 1, through aisle 7, across the shipping floor, then back toward receiving. Anyone watching from the upstairs office might have thought he wasn't working at all. He smiled, shook hands, asked questions, laughed. Sometimes he even stopped for a full minute. New employees often assumed he was simply the friendliest man in the warehouse. They were only half right. Frank wasn't only walking through the warehouse. He was quietly checking on the people who made it work. Long before computers measured productivity, Frank had discovered something much more difficult to measure. People carried invisible things to work every morning. Some carried excitement. Some carried worry. Others carried grief or hope. You couldn't see any of them on a spreadsheet, but if you paid attention, you could see them on people's faces. His own supervisor had taught him that lesson almost 40 years earlier. Old Mr. Harris had once closed the warehouse ledger, looked across the loading dock, and quietly said, "You can count boxes, or you can count people." Frank had never forgotten. The company eventually replaced the old ledgers with computers. The clipboards disappeared. The paper schedules became digital. But one thing never changed. Every morning Frank still counted people. On one particular Monday, a new regional executive arrived to improve efficiency. She carried an expensive laptop, a stack of performance reports, and one simple belief: if people spent less time talking, they would get more work done. Before the week was over, she would discover that the most productive 20 minutes in the warehouse looked exactly like people doing no work at all. Frank's old pickup truck rolled into the employee parking lot at exactly 6:40, not 6:39, not 6:41, 6:40. Every weekday. For almost 4 decades. He climbed out carrying a small lunch bag and the same worn leather notebook he had carried for years. He tucked it into his jacket pocket almost absent-mindedly, like someone carrying an old habit. Inside, the warehouse slowly came to life. Forklifts beeped softly as they completed their morning safety checks. Loading doors rattled open. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the break room. Frank smiled. He had always loved that first half hour. Before deadlines, before telephones, before everything became busy. It was the only time of day when people still had enough time to notice one another. The first employee through the door was Sarah. Frank smiled immediately. "Good morning, Sarah." She smiled back. "Morning, Frank. How's your mother?" Sarah's face brightened. "Much better. They finally let her come home yesterday." Frank nodded happily. "I was hoping you'd say that." Next came Jason. "Morning." Frank grinned. "Well?" Jason laughed. "You remembered." "I always remember." Jason pulled out his phone. "My daughter's piano recital." He proudly showed Frank a photograph. Frank studied it carefully. "I think she looks even more nervous than you." Jason laughed. "She was. But she played beautifully. I was sure she would." Miguel arrived, carrying a travel mug. His smile wasn't quite as easy as usual. Frank noticed immediately. "Morning, Miguel." "Morning. Did little Sophia finally let you sleep?" Miguel forced a smile. "A little." Frank nodded gently. We'll catch up later. No more questions. No pressure. Just an invitation. Miguel looked relieved. Thanks. One by one the employees arrived. Every greeting was different. Every conversation lasted only a few seconds. Yet somehow everyone walked onto the warehouse floor smiling. From the glass office overlooking the warehouse, Allison Reed watched the entire routine. She frowned slightly. The plant manager stood beside her. Allison asked, "Does he always do that?" "Every morning." "For how long?" The manager looked at his watch. "About 20 minutes." Allison looked genuinely surprised. 20 minutes? He nodded. Sometimes 25. She looked back toward Frank. At that very moment he was laughing with two forklift operators about someone's fishing trip. She quietly opened her laptop. "That's almost 2 hours every week." The manager smiled faintly. "It is." She began typing. "That's a lot of lost productivity." The manager looked down at the warehouse floor again, then quietly answered, "I used to think exactly the same thing." The following morning Allison arrived earlier too. Not because she enjoyed early mornings, because she wanted data. Real data. She believed every good decision should begin with careful observation. From the office, overlooking the warehouse, she started her stopwatch. 6:45. Frank began his walk, exactly as he had the day before. "Good morning, Emma. How's your mother's physiotherapy going?" Emma smiled. "She walked up 3 stairs yesterday." Frank grinned. "That's worth celebrating." "Morning, Ahmed. Nervous about Friday?" Ahmed laughed. "A little." "You'll do well." "I hope so." "You've been studying every lunch break." Frank smiled. "I'd bet on you." Ahmed laughed. "I wish my examiner felt the same way." Allison quietly entered numbers into her spreadsheet. Conversation. 48 seconds. Next conversation. 32 seconds. Next. 55. She continued timing every stop. Everything was measured. Everything was calculated. At exactly 7 o'clock, Frank closed the warehouse door behind the last arriving employee. The greetings were over. Everyone immediately began working. Allison looked at the final number. 21 minutes. She frowned. Almost exactly the same as yesterday. She opened another report. Then another. By lunchtime, she had produced 3 different charts. Each one reached the same conclusion. The warehouse was losing nearly 2 hours every week. That afternoon, she invited Frank into her office. He knocked gently. "You wanted to see me?" She smiled politely. "Please come in." Frank sat down comfortably. Not nervous. Not defensive. Simply curious. Allison turned her laptop toward him. "I've been studying the morning routine." Frank nodded. "I thought you might." She smiled faintly. "I timed every conversation." Frank looked genuinely impressed. "That sounds like a lot of work." She couldn't help smiling. It was. She pointed toward the chart. "If we shortened those conversations or removed them altogether, we'd recover almost 2 hours of productive time every week." Frank studied the numbers carefully. They were accurate. Every single one. He slowly nodded. "Your calculations are correct." Allison looked slightly surprised. "You think so?" "I do." She relaxed. "I was worried you might disagree." Frank smiled kindly. "Oh, I don't disagree with the numbers." She looked puzzled. What do you disagree with? Frank thought for a moment. The conclusion. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Allison asked, "Can you explain?" Frank gently shook his head. "No." She frowned slightly. "No?" He smiled. "I don't think explanations help very much." She looked even more puzzled. "What does help?" Frank stood. "Experience." He picked up his notebook from the chair beside him, then looked back at Allison. "If you'd like me to stop the morning walk, I'll stop." No argument. No complaint. No attempt to persuade her. Just simple acceptance. Allison blinked. "Just like that." Frank smiled. "You've been asked to improve the warehouse. Now it's my job to help you." For a brief moment, she didn't know what to say. The following morning, there were no conversations. Frank unlocked the warehouse, checked the loading schedule, reviewed the delivery board, and quietly went to work. Employees nodded politely as they walked past. He nodded back. No one stopped. No one smiled for very long. The warehouse had become noticeably quieter. From the upstairs office, Allison watched. She looked at the clock. 7 o'clock. Exactly. Not a minute had been lost. Her spreadsheet looked better already. For some reason, the warehouse didn't. The first few days passed quietly. Orders were shipped. Forklifts moved steadily through the warehouse. Delivery trucks left on schedule. If someone had looked only at the weekly report, they would have concluded the experiment was working perfectly. Productivity had improved. Morning conversations had disappeared. Exactly as planned. Frank never complained. He arrived every morning at 6:40, unlocked the warehouse, checked the loading schedule, reviewed the incoming deliveries, then quietly started work. The employees greeted him politely. He greeted them back. The routine had changed. The respect had not. Allison noticed something she hadn't expected. The warehouse had become more efficient, and strangely, very quiet. Gone was the easy laughter before the morning shift. Gone were the little conversations over coffee. People still worked together, but they no longer seemed to arrive together. They simply started their jobs. One afternoon, a forklift stopped unexpectedly in the middle of aisle 9. Miguel climbed down, shook his head. "The warning light's on." Frank walked over immediately. "No problem. We'll get maintenance." Miguel nodded. Normally, he would have smiled. Today, he simply looked tired. Frank noticed. He always noticed. While the mechanics checked the forklift, Frank stood beside him. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Frank asked quietly, "How's Sophia?" Miguel looked down at the concrete floor, then answered almost in a whisper, "She's back in hospital." Frank looked at him. "The fever came back?" Miguel nodded. "They admitted her yesterday." Another long silence. "I didn't want to tell anyone." Frank gently rested one hand on Miguel's shoulder. "You didn't have to, but I'm glad you told me." At that moment, Allison happened to walk through the warehouse. She wasn't trying to listen. She simply saw the two men standing together. She noticed something she hadn't seen before. Frank wasn't solving a work problem. He was helping a person. Miguel took a slow breath. "I don't know how I'm going to manage next week. My wife is exhausted. I'm exhausted. We're taking turns sleeping in the hospital." Frank nodded thoughtfully. When do you start tomorrow? 6. Frank smiled gently. I don't think you do. Miguel looked confused. No? No. I think you start at 10. Miguel stared at him. But who'll cover receiving? Frank smiled. We'll figure that out. Miguel immediately shook his head. I don't want special treatment. Frank's smile never changed. This isn't special treatment. He looked around the warehouse. It's Tuesday. Miguel looked puzzled. So? Frank chuckled softly. Tuesday is when half this place starts trying to help before anybody asks. For the first time all day, Miguel smiled. Only a little. But it was enough. That evening, after the warehouse had emptied, Frank opened his old notebook. He slowly turned a few pages, then made 3 short phone calls. Each conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. The following morning, before 6:45, Jason walked into Frank's office. I am here to take Miguel's early shift. A few moments later, Linda appeared. My husband says he can watch the baby one afternoon if they need him. Then Ahmed knocked on the open door. I've got Friday off after my exam. I can come over and stay late. None of them had been asked. Not one. Frank simply smiled. Thank you. From the office upstairs, Allison watched people quietly changing schedules, helping one another, covering shifts. No emails. No formal requests. No management meeting. She looked toward Frank's office, then back at the warehouse. For the first time, she asked herself a question no spreadsheet could answer. Why had everyone volunteered so quickly? The warehouse settled into its usual afternoon rhythm. Forklifts moved steadily between the loading docks. Orders were packed. Pallets disappeared into waiting trailers. Everything looked exactly as it had a week earlier. Except that Allison couldn't stop thinking about Miguel. And the way 3 employees had immediately volunteered to help. No emails. No formal request. No discussion. It had simply happened. Late that afternoon, she found Frank sitting alone in the break room. He wasn't drinking coffee. He was quietly writing in his old notebook. She knocked gently on the open door. Do you have a minute? Frank looked up and smiled. I was hoping you would show up. She laughed. You were? Yes, you've looked thoughtful all day. She sat opposite him. For someone who doesn't like giving explanations, you've certainly given me a lot to think about. Frank chuckled. I've reached the age where thinking is usually more useful than talking. Allison smiled. I believe that. Her eyes fell on the notebook. The famous notebook. Frank looked down at it. I suppose it has become rather famous. May I see it? He slid it across the table without hesitation. Of course. Allison opened the first page. She expected delivery schedules, inventory notes, performance reminders. Instead, she read, Emma, mother came home from hospital. Remember to ask next Monday. Jason, Emily's piano recital. Congratulate her. Miguel, baby Sophia. Hospital. Needs morning flexibility. Linda, 25 years with the company. Chocolate cake. Not vanilla. Allison slowly turned the pages. Every page looked the same. Names, families, birthdays, anniversaries, hospital appointments, exams, retirements. Little reminders. little pieces of people's lives. There wasn't a single production figure. She finally looked up. "Frank, where are your warehouse notes?" Frank looked genuinely puzzled. He glanced down at the notebook, then back at Allison. "Those are my warehouse notes." For several moments she simply stared at him. Finally she smiled. "I don't understand." Frank nodded gently. "I know. You will though." He closed the notebook, not dramatically, almost affectionately. "I've always believed that warehouses don't ship orders." Allison waited. "People do." He smiled. "And people carry far more than boxes." She looked at the worn leather cover. "It must be difficult remembering all this." Frank smiled. "I don't need to remember, because I write it down." A small pause. He gently tapped the notebook with one finger. "And I write it down, because I want to remember." The room became very quiet. Allison slowly ran her hand across the worn leather cover. The edges had become smooth after years of use. Several pages had been repaired with transparent tape. One corner still carried a faint coffee stain. This notebook had lived an entire working life. Just like Frank. She stopped at one page near the back. Only 3 words were written there. George. Retired. Fishing. She looked up. "Who's George?" Frank smiled immediately. "Our oldest forklift driver. He retired last year." Allison nodded. "And now he spends his time fishing?" Frank laughed. "That's what he told everyone." He leaned back in his chair. "He still drops in every Monday." She smiled. "Just to visit?" Frank nodded. "I think so." A pause. "Though he usually claims he came to borrow coffee." Both of them laughed. Allison slowly closed the notebook, then asked the question that had been growing inside her all afternoon. "Frank, how did you build this?" Frank looked around the break room, then toward the warehouse beyond the open door. Finally, he answered quietly, "I didn't." She frowned. "No." He smiled. "I simply remembered people long enough that they started remembering one another." For a long moment Allison didn't say a word. She looked through the warehouse windows. Jason was helping Ahmed secure a shipment. Linda was laughing with one of the newer employees. Miguel had just returned from a phone call. Someone handed him a cup of coffee before he even asked. Nobody had been instructed. Nobody had been told what to do. The warehouse simply worked. Not because everyone followed a system, because everyone trusted each other. As Allison stood to leave, she handed the notebook back. She paused at the door. "Frank?" "Yes." "I think." She smiled. "I've been measuring the wrong things." Frank smiled warmly. "I think you did measure the right things, but not yet all. So, that's a very good place to begin." The following Monday morning, Allison arrived before sunrise. For the first time in many years, she wanted to see the warehouse wake up. She carried no laptop, no performance reports, only a small notebook she had bought on her way home the previous Friday. It still smelled of fresh paper, but already had the first entries she had written down during the weekend. Frank's pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. 6:40. He climbed out, lunch bag in one hand, his old leather notebook in the other. When he reached the warehouse entrance, he looked slightly surprised. Allison was already waiting. She smiled. "I hope I'm not early." Frank laughed. You're exactly on time." For a moment they simply stood together. Then Allison held up her notebook. "I bought one." Frank smiled. "I can see that." She looked slightly embarrassed. "I have a feeling mine won't look like yours for a very long time." Frank chuckled. "Neither did mine in the beginning." The first employee walked through the door. Emma. She looked surprised to see both of them. Before Frank could speak, Allison smiled. "Good morning, Emma." Emma smiled back. "Morning." Allison hesitated only briefly, then said, "I hope your mother is feeling stronger." Emma stopped. She looked genuinely surprised, then smiled even more warmly. "She is. Thank you for remembering." After Emma had disappeared into the warehouse, Allison looked quietly at Frank. "I almost forgot." Frank smiled. "But you didn't." The next employee was Jason. "Morning." Allison smiled. "How's the future concert pianist?" Jason laughed immediately. "You remembered too?" She grinned. "Barely. But yes." He laughed as he continued toward the lockers. Frank looked at Allison. "You know, people usually remember that." "What?" "The effort." More employees arrived. The conversations weren't perfect. Sometimes Allison stumbled. Sometimes she needed to glance discreetly into her notebook. Nobody seemed to mind. Quite the opposite. People smiled. They laughed. One or two even teased her gently. Little by little, the warehouse began sounding like itself again. A few minutes later, George walked through the front door, carrying a fishing rod. Frank laughed. "I thought you came for the coffee." George grinned. "I did." He held up the fishing rod. "This is just to make the story believable." Everyone nearby laughed. George noticed Allison. "You're the new executive." "I am." He nodded toward Frank. "Take good care of him." Allison smiled. "I was hoping he'd take good care of me." George laughed. "Oh, he already is." George poured himself a cup of coffee, then looked around the warehouse. "You know, I retired almost a year ago." Allison nodded. "So Frank told me." George smiled. "I still haven't broken the habit." "What habit?" He looked around the warehouse with unmistakable affection. "Coming to where people know my name." The room became quietly still. George looked at Frank. "You built something special here." Frank gently shook his head. "No." George smiled knowingly. "There you go again." He raised his coffee cup toward the employees, arriving through the door. "I've worked in 5 warehouses. This is the only one that ever felt like people were happier to see each other than the delivery trucks." Laughter filled the room. Even Frank laughed. A little later, George quietly left for his fishing trip. As he climbed into his pickup, he waved toward the warehouse. Frank waved back, without a word. The gesture seemed almost routine, as though it happened every Monday. Allison watched and thought, chances are, it did. Then she looked at Frank. "I've spent 10 years learning how to improve efficiency." Frank listened. She smiled. "I think, this morning, I learned how to improve a workplace." Frank looked around the busy warehouse. Forklifts were moving. Orders were being loaded. People were laughing, helping, working. Then he quietly answered, "I think you started to learn how to improve people's mornings." A small pause. The work usually follows. 3 weeks later, Monday morning arrived just as it always had. At exactly 6:40, Frank's pickup truck rolled quietly into the parking lot. He smiled to himself. Some habits were too good to change. As he reached the warehouse entrance, he noticed someone standing outside. A young man, perhaps 22, holding a brand new safety vest, a lunchbox that still looked unused, and the unmistakable expression of someone wondering whether he had come to the right place. Frank walked over. "Good morning." The young man smiled nervously. "Morning, sir." Frank extended his hand. "I'm Frank." The young man shook it. "Ethan." Frank smiled. "First day?" Ethan nodded. "It shows?" Frank laughed. "Only because I remember mine." Just then the warehouse door opened. Allison stepped outside, carrying 3 cups of coffee. She stopped for a moment, looked at Frank, looked at Ethan, then smiled. She already knew exactly what to do. She walked over, held out one of the cups. "Welcome to the team, Ethan." He looked surprised. "For me?" "Of course." He accepted it carefully. "Thank you." Frank watched quietly. He didn't say a word and took the cup Allison held out to him with a friendly nod. Then he simply smiled. The 3 of them walked inside together. Employees were beginning to arrive. Emma waved. "Morning, Frank. Morning, Allison." Then she looked at Ethan. "New guy?" Frank nodded. "Ethan." Emma immediately smiled. "Welcome." A moment later, Jason walked in. Then Ahmed. Then Linda. Every single one greeted Ethan. Not because Frank had told them to. That was simply how mornings worked here. About an hour later, Ethan was helping Jason prepare the first shipment. He looked around the busy warehouse, then quietly asked, "Has everyone worked here forever?" Jason laughed. "No, but it surely feels that way." Ethan looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Jason smiled. "You'll understand." Before lunch, Ethan knocked gently on Frank's office door. Frank looked up from his notebook. "Come in." Ethan hesitated. "I just wanted to ask something." "Go ahead." The young man looked genuinely curious. "Why did everyone know my name before I'd even introduced myself?" Frank smiled. "I told them." Ethan laughed. "No, I mean, they acted as though they'd been waiting for me." Frank leaned back in his chair. For a few moments, he didn't answer. Then he smiled. "We were." Ethan frowned slightly. "You were?" Frank nodded. "Every new person changes a workplace." He looked toward the warehouse. "The question is whether we help them become part of it." Ethan looked around Frank's small office. His eyes fell on the old leather notebook. "Is that where you keep everyone's names?" Frank smiled. "Some of them." Ethan laughed. "Am I in there yet?" Frank opened the notebook. Turned to the last page. There, in neat handwriting, Allison had written earlier that morning. "Ethan, first day. Likes coffee with 2 sugars. Very nervous. Excellent handshake." Allison appeared in the doorway. Frank looked up. "I see. Someone's been helping." She smiled mischievously. "I thought, every notebook has to begin somewhere." "That is what I wrote in my notebook too." Frank laughed. "I think that's an excellent last page for mine. But be sure, I will start a new one. Allison smiled. I would not have thought otherwise. That evening, after the last truck had left, Frank switched off the warehouse lights. He and Allison walked slowly toward the parking lot. The building behind them had become quiet once more. Allison looked toward the rows of loading docks. I used to think that warehouses moved products. Frank smiled. And now? She looked back through the glass doors, then ahead to the car park. Employees were still laughing together beneath their cars before heading home. She smiled. Now I think they move people. Frank looked at her. She continued. Boxes leave the building. A gentle pause. But people carry what happens here back to their families every evening. Frank smiled. He had never thought of it quite that way. I like that thought. They reached their cars. Allison paused before getting in. Frank? Yes? She held up her notebook. Its pages were still almost empty. She smiled. I've got a lot of names to learn. Frank smiled back. No. You've got a lot of people to know. For a long moment, they simply smiled at one another. Then Frank climbed into his old pickup, started the engine, and drove slowly out of the parking lot. As he disappeared around the corner, Allison opened her notebook one more time. On the inside cover, she had copied one sentence from Frank's old notebook. Strangers wait for instructions. Communities solve problems. She gently closed the notebook, looked once more toward the warehouse, then whispered to herself, I think that's the kind of leader I want to become.